Well, a very good day. We're back, meaning Ken and I. We obviously used to have a subscription platform on the Sirius Plus channel, and we decided to actually dispense with that and go back to just recording free content for people to listen, which is in support of the Sirius report. So we've had a few months doing some other things, and Ken and I have decided we're going to start putting these reports out as and when we want to do them. There'll be no sort of fixed format, and we'll just see how we go from here. So obviously, Ken, thank you for joining me as ever.
Morning, Paul, and from across the pond. And hey, it looks like the world survived the eclipse yesterday.
Yeah, oddly enough. Yeah, I've never seen, anyway, such nonsense. You'd think the world was going to end, but then everything's a conspiracy theory these days. But anyway, we're not getting into that nonsense. But I'm glad you survived the experience anyway.
Absolutely. There's obviously some things we haven't talked about in 3 months since the last time we did a podcast, but that doesn't mean that events haven't been accelerating at a rapid rate. So one of the things I thought we might jump into first is Yellen's trip to China and the absolute waste of time that has turned out to be.
Yeah, I mean, well, interestingly, the last few months and going to the sort of back end of last year, the United States suddenly started to reach out to China. Okay, this is set against the backdrop that they're continually trying to undermine China with respect to Taiwan and trying to undermine the Chinese economy and trying to create fictitious enemies in the South China Sea to create some kind of alliance which is supposed to impede China's imperialistic progress in that part of the world, which, as we know, is utter nonsense. But we've talked previously, but not obviously in this platform, where Yellen went and asked the Chinese basically with a begging bowl to buy about $900 billion worth of treasuries because the United States has increasingly ran out of anybody who's prepared to buy US treasuries. And that's a whole separate discussion for another time. But that failed. And then Blinken's been there and various of the US officials. And of course, Yellen's now gone and spent a few days there. And again, then the private parties, without the begging bowl, we desperately need financing because we're reaching the point where we may have to print all US treasuries, which of course the United States doesn't want to do. People think there aren't consequences for that, but there most certainly is. And of course, there's all the usual Western media reporting that the Yellen's sticking it to the Chinese and being very tough with and saying, for example, well, if your Chinese banks continue to support Russia in the context of the Ukraine war, then we're going to sanction your banks. Well, here's the point. Any trade between Russian and Chinese banks will not be partaking via SWIFT. It will probably be via SIPs, in which case the United States will have zero visibility of it, in which case they're not going to be in any position to know what those banks are doing or aren't doing. So it's just meaningless hot air. It's also like trying to sound incredibly tough that, the United States has abused the dollar for decades. Its exorbitant privilege, where it just gave out worthless bits of paper and in return was given dollars to spend. It didn't mind when the boot was on the other foot, but now China is technologically making huge strides forward. The United States is unable to compete with them, and we've discussed this previously, but maybe we can touch on that in a bit more detail shortly. And now they're moaning and whinging about the fact that the United States is unable to compete with China, and therefore they're making these ridiculous accusations that China is overproducing goods and the Chinese government's producing massive subsidies so China can flood the market with cheap goods that the West simply cannot compete with, for all the reasons we've discussed as well previously, which is principally like more expensive energy, higher cost of living matrix, etc., all the things that makes the West significantly less competitive than the Chinese, for example. And that's the sort of nuts and bolts of why Yellen's gone there. It's to try and sound like the United States is still the hegemonic power, which it isn't. The Chinese are very polite, but don't take anything Yellen says particularly seriously. And I think it's very telling that just before even Yellen's left China, Lavrov rolls in from Moscow, meets not only Wang, but also has a meeting, and a very public meeting. Well, not the meeting itself, but shaking hands with Xi. There's no doubt it was to brief them on certain aspects of the conversations that were had that have nothing to do with what's going to be written subsequently in White House minutes or key takeaways written in press statements in the West, etc. And the other point worth making, which Yellen let slip, interestingly, is how the Chinese and the United States were conducting an exercise in assessing what might happen if one bank or other, depending whether it's in China or the United States, was to fail. Now, given China has state-owned banks, it is extremely impossible, it's impossible, frankly, for their banks to collapse, even though lots of people in the West likes to imagine they can. Certainly, the banks in the West could collapse. And I think this is more to do with the West or the United States admitting this could be a problem, and the Chinese wanting to understand from the United States perspective, well, if this does happen, how is this going to impact us? Because as much as they were largely insulated in 2008 from the so-called global financial crisis, there are risks if it happened again. So it is in China's interest to understand what those risks are, and if they have to take any remedial steps to avoid, obviously, suffering from some sort of systemic or contagion problem. And for me, that's the kind of nuts and bolts of what the meeting is about. There's other nuances and points you could raise as well, Ken, in that regard.
Yeah, the most important thing that we see coming out of the United States is, you made the alliteration in the past, is the emperor has no clothes. Everything is a projection. Everything is a scapegoat that comes from either Blinken or from Yellen. Biden is so far demented, he doesn't even know what he had for breakfast. So we push him out of the statement. But think about this: Yellen is accusing China of subsidizing their high-tech industry. Well, didn't we pass a CHIPS Act where the government was subsidizing the rise of semiconductor chips in the United States? Isn't that the bloody same thing that they're accusing China of? Or, of course, didn't we bail out GM? Didn't we bail out the banks? I'm sorry, but the entire thing is a crock and a load. And really what it is it's the fear of the United States, because we no longer have a manufacturing base, and China has taken over that position. And for the longest time, if China was bailing them out by buying treasuries, then the US didn't care. But now all of a sudden, China is leading the way, and nations are then following China in that context of, hey, we don't want the dollar. And you can see this when we talk about what's going on with gold and silver, because all the forecasts that you had put out in the past, of the event that would start leading to gold and silver prices rising, is coming to fruition. But we'll get to that a little bit later. The problem is that China has set itself up, and it's really the cyclical thing that happens over the course of a century or a cycle over a few centuries, is power and prosperity always shifts from east to west and back to west to east. And we're seeing that shift from the west to the east. And it's the equivalent of an empire dying and an empire falling, and they're lashing out on everything they can just to hold on to what little power they have, but it doesn't matter. Nature is far more powerful than anything that man can do. And the same thing with these type of cycles. They can try to, put it's like the kicking the can down from 1999, 2000, the dot-com bubble, and then kicking the can some more by QE after the 2008 global financial crisis. And now it's to the point that they can no longer kick the can down. We've reached that point of no return, the critical mass, where debt is going up exponentially, and there's just nothing to produce. So they've gone to the point now they're manipulating economic data, both for the political reasons, but also to try to keep the financialization system going. While in the meantime, China is building infrastructure and chips and technology, and we can't even deal with a dilapidated, broken down bridge.
Yeah, in Baltimore. Yeah, I mean, to sort of add some credence to what you're saying, I made a tweet, and I've had quite a lot of people getting in touch who have previously been fiercely critical of my stance that, US hegemony is on the way out or is effectively gone. And I put a tweet out listing points why the United States is not the exorbitant privilege it once had, why it's not an hegemonic power. And I listed a bunch of points, and people were going, do you know what? I hadn't really thought of it in that context. And that's, why, if you think the dollar isn't being rejected, why did the US have to print trillions of dollars alone during the pandemic? People talk about the United States and its energy reserves. Well, why is it a net importer of oil? And its shale oil and gas reserves are diminishing. There's no doubt about that. We talked about the inability to compete with China in new technological innovation. Why the United States went to war with Russia was because they provoked them, because China and Russia are challenging US hegemony and destroying it, not intentionally, but by virtue of the fact of saying, well, we want a level playing field where the dollar isn't dominant, and countries in the global south are able to utilize their own resources and to be able to benefit from the fruits of their labor, so to speak. And then militarily, it's irrefutable, because even the United States is admitting that Russia and now China are light years ahead, and the Ukraine war's been a disaster for not just the United States, but NATO, with all these game changers that are frankly useless. And the United States, yeah, the infrastructure's fallen apart, its healthcare system is, its education system is collapsing, as it is in other Western countries. And okay, a lot of people are against welfare, but you have to have a welfare system for when it's needed. That is non-existent. Its manufacturing base was hollowed out 20 plus years ago. It's dependent on China, Russia, and Iran and other nations for energy. I mean, the United States needs it for jet fuel and diesel, which it has to get from Russia or Venezuela or Iran. It's also dependent on them for critical resources. It's had massive underinvestment for decades. Its financial system is just propped up with endless covert money printing and other chicanery, which we've discussed this many times in the past. It certainly has a cost of living crisis. There are certainly inflationary pressures, and the economy is extremely weak. I mean, there's a lot of data that constantly comes out that proves this. It contradicts the narrative. Well, we have to keep interest rates high because the economy is strong and there's a risk of inflation. Well, again, inflation is not the reason for higher interest rates. It's all about trying to protect and preserve the dollar. But when you've got a shift away from full-time jobs that are higher quality jobs, better paid, to part-time jobs that are very low quality and low pay, that is not the sign of a strong economy. And the list goes on and on. And this is the reality of what the United States is now facing. And this is all being self-inflicted. And we're not even going to talk about US foreign policy. That's a whole separate discussion point. But all these things are the reason why Yellen is going off to China. And of course, for the Western media consumption, it has to sound as though we're being tough on China. But the world's looking at this and going, well, This is free market economics. If you can't compete, then, sorry, your business goes bust. I mean, but of course, the West is being propped up since 2008 on this endless diet. Well, nothing can fail. If something's going to fail, we'll just bail it out. We'll bail everything out. And we can't seem to accept the fact that in free market economics and in business, it's the survival of the fittest, effectively, in the sense that, if you can't compete with China to produce goods and sell goods, then ask yourself why you can't do this. And we know why, because precisely for all the problems we've created, even since Bretton Woods and then in 1971 when they went off the gold standard, and just this idea that we can spend with no cause for concern for what might happen tomorrow. We can abuse the dollar, abuse the fiat monetary system, and implement policies that were always going to be hugely detrimental and make not just the United States. I mean, look at Germany. Germany's created simply on the basis it no longer has cheap Russian energy. Notwithstanding, of course, it's not the sole problem, because equally it is just rested on its laurels and imagined that it could survive on traditional industry. And industry is always evolving, technology is evolving, and if you can't compete with the Chinese, then you need to find a way that you can work with the Chinese, so you can, on some level, find a way that you can have win-win cooperation. But the US consists on trying to win at all costs, and in the process, it's constantly losing at all costs.
No, absolutely. And, we're going to continue to see this trend accelerate. And, the problem too is that the United States, especially the United States, but the West as a whole, they've got a crisis of politicians. They have the absolute worst, lowest IQ bureaucrats in office now during what is a paradigm shift. And they're fine when it comes to when things are going smooth, and they can push through whatever their masters tell them to. But when the crisis of change is right amongst them, they have no idea what to do. They're not prepared in the least. And when you have all of these octogenarians from the Cold War period who still think that they run the world, and they're pushing through the same old stuff from the 80s and 90s, thinking that that's how the world works, it's any wonder that it really doesn't take that much for Russia and China, for India up to a point, for the Arab states to be able to move towards the future, because they're not stuck in the past the way the West is. And that's a lot of ways how empires fall. I remember a statement by, I forget who it was. It was one of the leaders, Bashar, I think, in the Ottoman Empire, and they were at the tail end of World War I, and they decided to, we're going to shift and go towards Central Asia instead of more towards Europe, which is where they were before. And so the race to Baku was on, because that was the oil center, and the British ended up beating them there. But they still want to hold on to their hegemonic power, not realizing that the world is changing around them and things are going to evolve. And instead of getting on board of moving to, how many chances did the United States have to join with the BRICS coalitions, or the new shift to multipolarity? Well, you had the 4 years of Trump, and Trump started to do some things, but unfortunately he was surrounded by people of the old school, and he inevitably decided, we're going to tariff China. We're going to screw them, and then we're going to rebuild our manufacturing base here. Well, it doesn't work that way, because corporations are just too powerful, and they own all the politicians for the most part. and they're going to do what they want to do, and they don't really care about the uh, sanctity and the security of the sovereign nation anymore. They're multinational. They see things as running the world from on high. So this is one of the important things that you have with Russia and China, is that they have control over their corporations rather than the corporations having control over the politicians. And that's why, if you go back to Mussolini, that's what fascism is. It's the merging of corporate and state, except the corporations dictate the means of production and distribution, versus socialism, which has the politicians do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just a fundamental problem where for the United States, they've had decades of being the hegemonic power, having the dollar. They didn't weaponize it like they have done, particularly since 2008 in various guises. But they've always had this attitude, well, we're the free world and everyone has to, obey the rules-based order. The rules-based order can change from 1 minute to the next, but who cares? Just you have to do what we say, when we say, and how we say. And we're going to change the entire world to be like us. So they thought dragging China into the WTO would westernize China. I mean, just completely clueless. And because the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians refuse to be westernized, they're demonized, and North Korea as well, as being these authoritarian states who aren't upholding the rules-based order, who don't want democracy, our style democracy, which isn't democracy at all. And of course, there's going to always become an inevitability that, as you say, and you're right, empires collapse for many different reasons. I mean, arrogance, ignorance is 2 points. Also, treating the people who made the empire with disdain, that's another. But also, just not recognizing the fact that your standpoint can be alien to the entire world. And if you don't accept that eventually there will come a point when the world will bite back and say enough's enough, then you're going to end up in a situation, because you refuse to evolve, that the US now finds itself in the predicament it's in. And it is why it wants to go to war with China over Taiwan. Well, not directly, but wants China to invade Taiwan for the same reason it's trying to destroy Russia, because it now realizes that these two nations are challenging US hegemony. They have the resources, they have food security, they have energy security, and collectively, the sum of their parts is infinitely greater. And China's making massive strides forward technologically, and it isn't stealing technology as it once did. And people just will not accept the reality. Well, if you don't accept the reality, the inevitability is, in the end, the empire will collapse and cease to exist. And that's the point we're at. And people think it's 10, 20, 30 years away. Well, it isn't. We're right on the cusp of it ending. I mean, we don't put dates on things for obvious reasons, but we're in that window now. And it's self-explanatory when you highlight some points that I had people getting in touch going, do you know what? I never thought of it like that. When you put those stark cold facts in the context of, well, what we used to call a tweet, now a post, it makes people realize the United States, how vulnerable it is. And that was by no stretch of the imagination exhaustive in the points. I mean, you could have gone on and talked about foreign policy, etc., but it highlights the weakness of the United States, and why, if the US was in a strong position, it wouldn't be going to China at all to talk to financial officials. I mean, that's the thing. Predominantly, it was discussions with the PBOC governor, with the economic ministers, finance ministers. It's all about finance. Why? Because the United States now recognizes privately its vulnerability, even if publicly it will claim to the contrary. But you are starting to hear more and more noises from interesting parties that, well, things aren't panning out for the United States the way we expected to. I mean, they're never going to utter the words of de-dollarization directly or suggest the United States hegemony's over, but you can know privately. There's certainly enough discussions that are alluding to that fact. And occasionally odd statements publicly, whilst not directly alluding to it, are certainly indirectly alluding to that very point.
Very much so. Anyway, let's go ahead and transition over to what's going on in the Middle East. Obviously, since we've talked, we've had where Israel has decided to go full bore into whatever it's decided to do. I don't want to say that Netanyahu has decided to make greater Israel and use the Hamas attack to generate this, but by attacking a embassy and breaking the longstanding taboo of going after sovereign protected diplomatic buildings, well, now all of a sudden the cat is out of the bag. We saw this, I think Ecuador went in and took the former vice president who was seeking refuge in a Mexican embassy. That has already taken place. And Iran, of course, now is sitting there planning what to do in regards to retaliation, but the United States is desperate for Iran not to do anything at all. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on what you may have heard in regards to the U.S. trying to rein in Iran while at the same time playing both sides of the fence in supporting Israel.
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to go through the whole discussion of the war. We'll just try and focus on this point. It's a big enough point in of itself, but it's clearly obvious that the war's not panning out for Israel the way they, would like everyone to believe. I mean, they haven't defeated Hamas. It's 6 months now. I mean, they've moved military personnel out of various regions. They've left the south, although that might be just a precursor for the belief that Netanyahu wants to strike the Rafah crossing. And the United States is told him in no uncertain terms not to do it, not that he's going to listen to that. So that there could be various reasons. But the point with regards to why the Israelis hit the Iranian embassy in Damascus in Syria was to try and drag Iran into a wider war. Why? Because the war isn't panning out for Israel. They're desperate to get the United States to be more directly involved in the war, as they seem to believe very stupidly that the US was going to do that. We made this point all along. People got very angry with me for saying the United States was not there to go to war with Iran. Well, 6 months later, anyone who's denying that, I'm sorry, is just denying reality. They do not want a war. And we'll come on to some of the reasons why, and part of what Iran's options are with respect to Israel itself. But it's clear there's provocation. They desperately want the war to become a regional war. They want to try and open up a proper front with Hezbollah, who've been very restrained as well. There's been cross-border skirmishes, but nothing that you would call an all-out war. But Israel would like. It's because they're losing. They're not winning the war. Their public opinion is hugely against them, even in Western nations. And ironically, a lot of Western allies have really fed up with Israel's conduct. The whole issue of war crimes and genocide. There's too much evidence there which proves their culpability for this. And people can sit there and deny it, but it's impossible to do so. So, coming to your point, Ken, what can Israel expect from Iran? Well, there was all these rumors that, which is all on media clickbait, that Iran was going to respond almost immediately, and they will never respond immediately. They're calculating. They're not going to have a knee-jerk reaction and go, well, because you hit our embassy, we're going to go and blow up an embassy, Israeli embassy somewhere. They just simply will not do that. They will think about this, and there's no doubt there is being back-channel discussions on this very matter between between the United States and Iran, as there has been since October the 7th, because the US doesn't want Iran to get into a regional war for very obvious reasons, and we'll come on to that shortly. But the point about this is that they will have had discussions. Now, there was claims that the United States had said, well, if you want to hit a target, as long as you don't hit US assets, we'll turn a blind eye. That's possible, but there's no absolute definitive evidence to support that. But clearly, the United States would rather Iran didn't respond at all. Now, there are also claims the Iranians have said, well, if we don't respond, then they've said to the United States, you need to force Israel into a permanent ceasefire, the return of hostages and the end of all hostilities. Now, the US has kind of come out and said, well, that's not the case, but it doesn't mean it isn't the case. They're not going to publicly say that, because then it puts them in a very difficult position with Israel. Now, no doubt, they're arming Israel to the teeth. They're financially supporting them. But that's one thing, because they have no choice but to do it, because the Israeli lobby controls the Beltway, controls Congress, effectively. So they're caught between a rock and a hard place. But does it mean they want the war to escalate? Absolutely not, because there's no telling what the outcome will be. And with Iran has options, and they've come out today, made a very off-the-cuff statement. Remember, we can shut the Hormuz Strait, which they can, and if they do, oil prices will spike to $200 a barrel quite easily, and then the Western financial system will probably collapse. And there are a whole bunch of other problems, financial and economic, that would come as a result of that. So the United States doesn't want that to happen. The other thing is, nobody's quite sure what missile technology the Iranians have. There are suspicions they have nuclear weapons. I'm not entirely sure they have or they haven't. What they do have, though, and this is very worrying as well for the United States, is they have hypersonic missiles now. Now, again, the West will claim, well, we're not really sure what these Fatah-2 hypersonic glide missiles do, but they've got a range of probably 1,500 kilometers, maybe more. They've got a speed anywhere up to Mach 20. They can adjust trajectories, so they can have high maneuverability at that speed. There's no way the US or Israel has got any means of shooting these missiles out of the sky, Iron Dome, or anything else. And therefore, there's no response. So if Israel was provoked into a huge response, they could cause untold damage to Israel. And I think this is where the bit about, well, don't touch our assets from Iran is probably, there's some truth to that. Because if the United States' entire fleet in West Asia was sunk, they would never get over the humiliation of it. It would be just really the end. It might be another signal of the end of NATO. I mean, they've suffered enough humiliation in Ukraine. The US doesn't want that. It doesn't want an escalation because it knows it's a sitting duck. I mean, Iran in principle could go and take out all US military bases in the entire Middle East. I'm not suggesting they will, and I don't think that will happen. But this is the quandary the US finds itself in. But Israel, though, just wants, or Netanyahu wants the provocation to be met with Iranian response, and they want the Iranian response to be as damaging as possible. So then they can say to the US, right, well, Iran's now the aggressor, which arguably it wouldn't be, of course, given what Israel's already done, but they would try and spin it into Iranian aggression and then try and drag the US into a war where the US starts targeting Iranian sites inside Iranian soil. Now, the US, of course, doesn't want this in any way, shape, or form, but no one should underestimate the leverage Iran has in the region, militarily, economically, financially. And the restraint they've shown thus far has been appreciated not just by the United States, but also by West Asian countries like the Saudis, the Qataris, the UAE. And the landscape in the Middle East or West Asia has changed so much in the last 6 months. I mean, there was a point where the United States thought they were making some progress in getting nations to have rapprochement with Iran. Well, all that goodwill's gone, given how the war's being prosecuted by Israel in the process. But thus far, Iran hasn't responded. Will there be a response? Iran says there will. What that response will be remains to be seen. But the bottom line is the US doesn't want this escalating, and it certainly doesn't want to end up going to war with Iran. If Iran was to go and sink the US fleet, that's an entirely different matter. But if Iran avoids any direct confrontation with Israel, with the US, then that isn't going to happen. The other alternative, just a small point, but an important point to make, is Iran does have a lot of proxies inside Syria, inside Iraq, and they could quite easily use those proxies to attack targets in Iran, which has already happened over the last 6 months. There could be a major escalation in that regard, and then Iran can sit there and go, well, we didn't attack you, even though, of course, they could be, and they'll largely recognize as being Iranian proxies, although sometimes that's just an excuse to accuse Iran of instigating conflict in the Middle East or West Asia, which we should refer to it as. So, yeah, don't underestimate the capability of Iran. People do, and it will be extremely dangerous to do so. But the idea, and I've seen some nonsense that the United States will invade Iran. Well, Iran's got a military in excess of 1 million. The United States, if it tried to launch ground forces into Iran, will be massacred. It will never happen. And it comes back to the point, for me, for anyone who sits there and suggests the United States wants to go to war with Iran, they're just demonstrating total ignorance about the region, because we could go on for hours about Iran's capability and how it shouldn't be misunderstood. But given the rapprochement and the change of the entire landscape of West Asia, even more so, Iran can just sit there and do nothing because Israel's destroying itself by virtue of its actions. So why would Iran give Israel the opportunity to try and claw back some leverage and some of the PR, and also to try and force the United States to respond? Because I think genuinely, when the US put their strike carriers in the Middle East or in the Mediterranean, people go, oh, it's because they're going to launch an offensive. And I said it's not anything to do with that. It's merely a defensive mechanism to remind the Iranians, do not launch a preemptive strike on Israel. If Israel attacks you, it's an entirely different matter. But there is no way the US wants that war with Iran, because what benefit is it to the US? None. And the optics would be absolutely horrendous, never mind what it would do to the whole region in a wider war and all the death, carnage, which of course everyone should be appalled. It's bad enough what's happened in Gaza, but if you were to extrapolate that into Lebanon, into Syria, Iraq, Iran, etc., nobody who's sane of mind would want to see that happening.
No, and when you take a look at it, the U.S., which loves to impose its will on any lesser nation, like either Iraq, Afghanistan, floating around in the South China Sea, making, swinging their bat and acting like they're the big man on campus. The reality is that if there was a conflict in Iran, the U.S. is already stretched out beyond thin, and Iran already has military treaties with, I think, both Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia. The UAE has already kicked Israel out diplomatically for what it's done, and has cut off its energy supplies. I think if the U.S. got involved in one place, it would be open season on every one of these foreign bases or places that they have. And the U.S., because, back in the day, having an ocean between you and your enemies was a benefit. But to be able to impose your will, you have to put 800 bases and be infiltrated into all these countries. Well, there's a downside to that too, because you cannot support every single one in the case of a conflict. And I think the U.S. knows that it would lose its foreign influence, because those would be the primary targets that Iran and their allies would go after, it would open the door for China to pretty much do. Because what happens to the U.S. if all of a sudden you're finding yourself at odds with about 5 to 8 to 10 different fronts at once? You can't do it. So the U.S. has used the stick and the carrot for most of its illustrious empire. But since it's run out of any carrots, and as we saw in Afghanistan, the stick is kind of blunted rather than sharp anymore. Iran, the smartest thing they can do, in my opinion, is to leverage this to get the United States, to get other nations, one, on their side, but two, to get some of the other concessions that they need. Because an attack on the embassy outside of their country, as well as, okay, you got some generals killed, as long as they do the right things, Israel will continue to be propped up in some of the media as genocide, some of the media as the rogue aggressor, going after the poor Palestinians. And the last thing they want to do is to change the perspective that Hamas was Iran and Hezbollah is Iran and all of these other things that make it suddenly where Israel is the victim. And of course, the United States and Europe have justification to go in and do, make this a much wider conflict. If I were as Iran in the back channels, I would be telling the United States, giving them pseudo ultimatums. You're going to stay out of this, or you're going to shut down these bases here. You're going to do this. You're going to put pressure on Israel. If you don't, then, hey, you know what? Be prepared, because we are going to respond in our own time, and we're going to make sure we have the agreements from much of the Arab League, from Russia, so that if there's retaliation, we're backed up.
Yeah, you make a really good point, though, when you talk about the United States being stretched. And this is the point. Look at the Ukraine war. The US is not directly involved. I mean, people keep saying they are. There might be 200 or 300 US mercenaries inside Ukraine. There might be 500 trainers. This is not the United States directly at war. It's a proxy war that the US is fighting. Of course it is. But they're not directly at war. Why? Because the United States doesn't have the military resources and the capability to put forces in and fight a war against Russia, never mind the fact that that would be a prelude to World War III, which the United States and Russia do not want to happen. But with regards to Iran, who is the United States going to find as proxies to fight a war with Iran? Because if Israel tries to fight a war with Iran, it's simply not going to be possible to do so. Yeah, they could cause immense damage with firing missiles into it, and heaven forbid nuclear weapons, arguably, or I think that would be extremely unlikely to happen, because the consequences for Israel, then the United States would step aside and go, you're on your own, we're not defending you anymore. So the point is, who's going to fight the war? If the United States wanted a war with Iran and it doesn't, no one's going to go and fight a war against Iran. Rather, like, who's going to fight a proxy war for the United States in Taiwan? No one. Who? The Japanese? No. The South Koreans? Forget it. No one is going to fight proxy war. They were able to utilize Ukraine as a proxy war because of the abject hatred for enough people inside Ukraine with Russia to be able to start a war and continue the war. And there was enough support in Europe because of all the rabid Russophobic attitudes that have been endemic for decades and beyond. It's an entirely different matter. But the US is not going to fight a direct war. It doesn't have the military capability or the stomach to do so. So Iran is just a situation where, if there was an escalation, the US is going to feel obliged to do something. And it would probably have to do something in conjunction, ironically, with the Russians, the Chinese, or whoever else, to say, this is now totally out of hand. We're going to have to deal with this. But how do you deal with it? And this is back to the point. Yes, the United States is completely contradictory in its behavior because it doesn't want Israel to do certain things, but it will arm Israel to the teeth to continue fighting the war. It's a contradiction, but it's a contradiction that makes complete sense. And even though they're very polarized perspectives, they can sit with each other very easily because they're totally different situations between arming them to fight a war and how they conduct the war and escalating that into a broader conflict. But I think it's an issue that's ongoing. It's developing. There will be an Iranian response in some capacity. Remains to be seen what that response is. But if the United States, I'm not saying it will happen, but if for argument's sake, they were able to force Israel's hand and there was a truce, and then there was a lasting settlement, the war ended, then Iran will not respond. But if this carries on and Israel was then to escalate, and then because bombing or having a military intervention in Rafah, which they've threatened to do, and the United States has told them not to do it, but they probably won't listen if that escalates as part of this ongoing war and conflict, then Iran might then feel obliged to respond with more severe measures than it would do even at this point in time. But there will be a response. Hopefully there isn't, because if there isn't, it means the war's ended. But we shouldn't imagine the war's going to end that easily, because Netanyahu has to keep the war going, because once the war's over, politically, he's probably finished in Israel. And then there's the small matter of these charges hanging over him. I mean, is he then going to be prosecuted and have to face, criminal proceedings and end up in court, etc.? And then we don't know what the outcome is going to be, because again, we don't prejudge this. This is not what we're here to do. But he's facing a very uncertain future, and from his perspective, he wants the war to carry on. But whether the appetite for that war to carry on inside Israel itself in certain quarters is diminishing, in others it's increasing, because politically it's a very fractured nation. But there is no way, in any way, shape or form, the United States want this to escalate. And Iran is quite a formidable opponent. And if it has nuclear weapons, as the United States fears, then that changes the whole the whole complexion of how the US would approach the matter of Iran and confrontation indirectly or directly with them.
No, absolutely. Well, let's transition real quick over to gold and silver. I tell you what, for a long time, or actually for a short window, I don't want to say a long time, a short window, there was all the hoopla over the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency ETFs. And a lot of money was funneling in from investors into Bitcoin, driving it up from the 40,000 range up to 72,000, where it sort of peaked. But at the very same time, go back to October of last year, gold had, at least the spot price of paper markets, had bottomed out at about 1891. And since that time, we have seen an acceleration, especially over the past month and a half. Now, if people think of it just on the US side, well, it's just a pump, or, it's people moving into safe havens, moving out of treasuries, because we're starting to see gold prices rise at the same time that yields are rising, which is something that normally doesn't happen unless there is a force majeure taking place. And that force majeure, in my opinion, is the Shanghai Gold Exchange, because it started out about maybe 50 cents higher than the spot price coming out of the London Gold Fix and the COMEX each day. Now, gold or silver prices are up over $31 in the physical market in China. Gold is up over, at least I saw the other day, $2,400. And a lot of gold is being sold physical out of London, out of the COMEX. Switzerland almost isn't even a player anymore. So I think that one event that you had been pushing and promoting for so many years, that we would finally start to see prices rise when the West ran out of metal. And I wanted to see if you thought we were really at that day.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because I first said this, the true price discovery won't happen in the West until the West is drained of gold and by extension silver. And are we at the point? Well, there are many encouraging signs to suggest it, but I wouldn't definitively say we are definitely at this point in time. What we can say, though, unequivocally, is that the demand in China is enormous. And this isn't just Chinese, the PBOC, who for 17 straight months have been buying gold. Now, there's the official amount the last month for March was 5 tons, but it's considerably more. We know China has vast gold reserves of about 40,000 tons. It's the biggest gold producer in the world. But it's not exclusively China that's buying it, but there's Chinese people are buying enormous amounts of gold. But the general trend has been gold heading from west to east, and all the data proves this. And we always said there will come a point when the Western paper markets are sufficiently drained of metal that they cannot risk force majeure, in the sense they can, there's never been, for one paper contract is backed by 1 ounce of gold. We know it's maybe 1 ounce of physical for 200 ounces of paper, whatever the ratio is. It could be
I saw
higher.
I saw 372 the
Yeah,
other
it could
day.
be. I'm just using it as to illustrate the point. It could be even higher than that. But the point is, there comes a point where if the West is sufficiently drained, and we'll use gold as an example, then it cannot risk constantly smashing the price, because it may then reach a situation where the buying continues to increase in the West. Although the interesting part is the price is accelerating, not because, the interest in the West is not that great still, and whether it's physical buying or notional exposure via ETFs, which is very questionable in most situations, not all of them. But that's not happening in the West. But the drain from west to east is such that the paper markets are struggling in the West to suppress the price. Now, we've seen instances where they've tried to smash the price, and very rapidly it's bounced back and continued marching northwards. It's happened on several occasions, and it's just not making a scrap of difference. And this is where that you could arguably say there's encouraging signs that the West has lost control of those markets. And that's why the paper markets are having to move northwards to try and start to reflect price discovery. There's an argument they're hoping, well, if the price starts hiking, then we might start getting some people in the West selling. And that might help reduce the imbalance between physical and non-physical, to the point that we can manage our paper markets again. Thus far, that's not happened. And gold's roughly at 23.40, 23.50 in dollar terms, and silver's around 27.80, $28 an ounce. And there has been a sharp increase in the last 6 months. In fact, Ken, I remember gold hitting nearly 1,800 an ounce. So it's gone up roughly in that time 30%. In 6 months. Or should I always actually refer to it, the dollar has fallen 30% in terms of gold. Now, that in of itself is extremely telling, because people are trying to convey the impression the reason there's massive demand for gold in the East is because they're trying to protect their own exposure to their weak currency. It's got nothing to do. They're trying to protect their exposure to the dollar, to dollar-denominated asset. That is why it's happening. That's why China's doing it. It's got nothing to do with this mythical Chinese weakness. The Chinese runs massive trade surpluses. Its economy is not weak the way the West makes out. It doesn't need to be dumping treasuries. to pay its bills because it's got dollar shortage. It's got $13 trillion equivalent in forex reserves. It's absolutely ridiculous that these statements are made. But this is trying to disguise the fact that if you look at the price of gold and what it was when they started to raise interest rates, and that's when you'd expect the gold price to fall, and it's gone up in that time, I think roughly 20% or so, roughly. Now, historically, that is unprecedented. And it's quite interesting when you look at the gold price in dollars and you look at it in tips terms. Tips would kind of indicate that gold should be at about $1,200 now. Well, yeah, because that's what the US expected would have happened. But they raised interest rates and it did nothing. It's done nothing. All it's done is accelerated the gold heading from west to east. There was always going to come a pinch point. Are we definitely there? I wouldn't say definitely at this point. But if this carries on for another 2-3 months, then you might start to say, yes, we've reached a point where the paper markets in the West are broken. And if you look at oil, oil's another indication. You know, the US was desperately trying to get oil down to $70 a barrel. They've given up. Now, you know, Brent's trading at nearly $90 a barrel, and US crude's about 85. And the US was trying to smash the price, also to obviously once again replenish the SPR reserves that they basically reduced to levels we've not seen in decades. And now it's too expensive, and they've abandoned that idea. So it's not just what's happening in gold and silver, we're seeing it in oil. There's arguably questions regarding other commodities where commodity prices are not reflecting the paper illusion, they're more reflecting physical reality. And I keep seeing people saying, well, gold price is overheating. How can a gold price overheat if it's based on physical reality? A price doesn't overheat if you have a physical metal to buy and sell. The price overheats based on mythical technical analysis that says this is a resistance point, this is a support point. The RSI is screaming, so now people should be selling. Why would people be selling gold on the basis of some technical threshold being reached when you're buying gold to protect yourself against all eventualities? That's the point of gold. And silver, well, silver's an industrial metal, so it's different. But if we take gold from an investment perspective, it is there as to protect you against all eventualities, of which there are many now, you know, on the cusp of happening. It's got nothing to do with trying to make a profit. Yeah, some people could do so, and fine. But if you're actually investing in gold to make fiat profit, then you don't understand what gold's about. It is about preserving your wealth, and it's about future purchasing power. So I am encouraged by what I'm seeing, but have we reached the definitive point? I wouldn't say so. What will be very interesting is we're seeing, you know, central banks, sovereign nations continuing to buy gold, some even in Europe and certainly across the world. But more importantly, when are we going to start seeing, you know, a gold interest in buying gold in the West? When we see high net worth in interests or institutions actually buying, and also you might even argue to some degree retail wanting to buy it, because the day will come when that will happen. If it happened now, then it would massively change the perspective on the price of gold or the paper price in the West. And I think this is also bears out exactly what we said in the past. The big push to get people to buy Bitcoin and call it digital gold was to stop retail and other investors piling into gold, because that would have, if that had happened and all this money had been in gold, the paper price or the price in the West would have been considerably north of where it is now. Because again, this fracturing and breaking of the paper markets would have happened a lot sooner. So I wouldn't say definitively. I'm not hedging my bets here. I've said for 10 years what would happen. we're seeing things happening. We expect it to happen. But it's the old saying, one swallow doesn't make a summer. So don't make the assumption, because in a month or two, we could be talking gold. I'm not saying it will, gold back at 1900, because all suddenly there isn't the demand anymore. And maybe the markets change, something happens. But as long as the demand continues in the East, which it is, then it's going to be a real struggle to suppress the price in the West. And if the West suddenly joins in and starts buying metal because of financial event, economic event, geopolitical event, then the price will only continue to rise more, because then the paper market's then not only suffering drainage from west to east, but then in the West itself. And if the West is drained of metal and people in the West want it, where are they going to get it from? And then that starts to raise the question, well, are the Chinese going to sell it back and other nations to the West? Probably not. So then that raises the question, well, if there's a demand in the West and it doesn't exist, what does that do to price discovery? And we're not here to make guesstimates, but it's going to have a huge impact, and that is irrefutable. What it does to the price, frankly, I don't care. It's not my concern. It never has been. I'm interested in what's happening, but for me, gold is about preserving your wealth and future purchasing power. And when the financialization of assets finally collapses in the West, that's when its purchasing power will mean you can buy an asset that might currently cost you X ounces of gold, for argument's sake, and it's going to be X minus Y, and Y will be a very significant percentage of X in the process. That's what I'm interested in. But it's in a broader context, for sure, it's interesting. I'm not diminishing it, but I'm not at this point going to say definitively with her and we're home and dry, because I'm not entirely convinced we are, but we're seeing encouraging signs on a weekly basis to suggest the markets are changing, but it's not clear cut, because we have seen situations with gold spiking before and then falling back. Okay, we're in different territory now when we're making new all-time highs in dollar terms once or twice a week, maybe even more. So the argument is it's a different environment than we've seen previously, but we have to be a bit cautious. And I'm saying that as someone who has talked about this for longer than I care to remember, and nobody took any notice of it predominantly. But now it's proving to be the case. There's certainly evidence to support that perspective, but let's not get carried away too soon.
I'm absolutely in agreement with that, because when the price started going up, all of a sudden you started seeing technical analysis go out the window. To me, once the price really started to rise, once they hit that all-time high over 2,100 and then started moving towards 2,400 within a month for gold, I had to really start looking at all the fundamentals behind it. Well, what was one of the fundamentals? We are in a global recessionary, at least in the West, recessionary period. So that means demand for commodities should have declined, but the price of commodities are going up. So really, this isn't a move in gold and silver. This is a move in commodities in general. Secondly, the fundamentals. Nobody in the West is buying it. This move is not occurring by anybody in the US or in Europe. It's all being done from prices affected out of China, out of Turkey, out of India, out of the East. So you can't really have officially a move in gold and silver prices unless the entire market as a whole is involved in it. And lastly, take a look at what China has been forced unto. Yellen and the Biden administration has been cutting them off from capital inclusion into certain areas. You can't really, they're being scrutinized if you want to invest in China. You're being scrutinized if you want to invest in Russia. You're being scrutinized if you're selling goods, like high-end EVs or chips or whatever, across the board. China also went through a housing bubble that they had to deal with. People used to put all their money into their homes. Then they had the stock market decline. So fewer and fewer people in China are putting money into stocks after that little boom. So where are they putting their money into? And you can see this at the domestic level. It's not just the PBOC, it's not just central banks. The Chinese people are buying into gold in massive quantities. And that's why, in my opinion, the physical price is really starting to move up in the Shanghai Gold Exchange. Because if it was simply an arbitrage between the East and West, then the spread would be probably a lot closer than it is. But if physical demand is as abundant in China, maybe in Singapore, in all around that area as it is, then it's driving up the price of the Shanghai Gold Exchange. It's increasing the spread between East and West, and Shanghai is just buying everything hand over fist that it can get from the COMEX and from London.
Yeah, and also, as you say, from Switzerland, it's draining everywhere. And the question is, at what point? I mean, when is the West? I mean, because sometimes people have misunderstood. When I say the West is drained, we'll just deal with gold. Then when's it drained? It doesn't mean it's literally there's an ounce of gold, because there's people like me who've got gold and Ken and whoever else. It's not like there's no gold. We have to be careful when we say this. But with regards to silver, an interesting point is the Indians bought huge amounts in 2022. They bought only maybe 3,000 tons in 2023. They're back on another binge, and they're expected, I think the rise between January and February was 300% in tonnage terms. So they're back buying, and China continues to buy enormous amounts of silver. So if the physical silver market is also being starved in the West, which it is, because that kind of tonnage is going to India, China, and other nations. The other point is there is retail buying of silver also, not so much in China, a little bit, but certainly in India. So the question then is that starts to impact the availability of silver as an industrial metal and silver as an investment. Now, metal and industry accounts for about 60%, and 40% is investment. So this is another problem the West facing. And also, the question is more and more mines potentially who can mine silver. Not necessarily silver, because there's not many pure silver mines. Some of them are just byproducts of other mining. But if that starts to diminish, that's happening, then that starts to put pressure on the silver markets as well. And it comes back to the point is sometimes with regards to gold being the price it is, people go, well, it's a bit expensive, so I'll buy silver instead. There has been spurts where retail were buying silver quite heavily, and gold and the price was responding in the West. But as I say, if it happens in conjunction with this huge buying that's going on in the rest of the world, particularly in the global South, then that could then be a situation where instead of saying, well, cautiously, we're having encouraging sign, the paper manipulation's ending, we could then be in a situation where we might be saying definitively, yes, that's ending. And another point worth making, because people are looking at things like cocoa and a massive spike in the price, go, well, that could happen to silver. Be extremely careful having that kind of perspective. I'm not saying silver can't make very large moves northwards in a short space of time, but don't extrapolate what happens in one commodity for one commodity and imagine it definitively happens with silver. The point about it is, if we want markets to be true price discovery, which is on the basis of physical demand and supply, then it has to work correctly. We can't go, well, now it seems to be working a bit and we feel a bit aggrieved that silver and gold's been suppressed for years. We don't want to see it spike and end up a lot higher. It equally has to reflect reality. So if there is enormous demand for gold and silver, then the price will have to shift accordingly. But if the demand was to wane for some reason, which may happen, then the price has to reflect that equally. It's a two-way street. We can't decide that things work for us, and therefore we want to see the price massively higher. But again, it's not about what the price is. It's what is that price in terms of preserving your wealth and in future purchasing power. That's the point of this. So I don't get too bogged down in the price. But what I would say is I think if gold hits in dollar terms 2,500 an ounce, maybe 2.6, maybe 2.7, you might start to see people in the West start to want to buy it. And then things would get extremely interesting, because if there's people in the West wanting it and the people in the East want it, then we might start to see some very interesting price movements accordingly, if people want to discuss it from a price movement perspective. But because I always said 2.5, 2.6, 2.7 for me was where it might get really interesting from a West perspective. And it remains to be seen if that is indeed the case.
I agree.
Okay, anything else, Ken? Or
no, I think on our comeback show, I think we covered geopolitical, political, and some financial stuff, and I think it was a good start.
Yes, and obviously, thank you very much for joining me today, Ken. Much appreciated, and we look forward to doing more of these in the future. And I'll say goodbye, and from you, Ken.
Absolutely. Be well, everybody, and see you next time.
Yeah, catch you soon. Okay, bye then.